Welcome back, everyone, to Radio Rothbard. No Ryan for this episode, but I'm glad to be joined with a good friend of mine, Norm Singleton, a legend within Capitol Hill circles and a senior fellow for the Market Institute. Norm was a longtime legislative director for Ron Paul, got a lot of battle scars with some of the battles going on up there for a very long time. Norm, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great. It's so great to talk to you. The highlight of my time up in DC was, the times we spent with Paul Martin Foss's homebrew beer, and Ron Paul's office was a little safe space in a sea of insanity, up there in DC. How did you, Norm, get within this crazy world in the first place? What got you into the Austrian economics world? I know there's a Norm Singleton brick at the Mises Institute. What brought you in here?
I had a professor when I was in college. Actually, it started interest because of a deal that I made with my dad. I wanted to be pre-law, and so I was looking at poli-sci history, and my dad, being a very practical person, said, what if you don't get into law school? You won't be able to get a job, so why don't you major in accounting or business? And I kind of rolled my eyes. And so we agreed on economics as a compromise because it was liberal artsy, social sciencey for me, but it was also had that practical side of it to make my dad, who was paying the bills, happy. And because of that, I took an Econ 101 class from a professor named Felix Livingston. And I remember, interestingly, what started me on my journey. I came from a conservative family. My grandparents were Taft Republicans. My grandmother was actually a delegate for Nixon in '68 at the Miami convention. The only member of my family to not vote Republican in any election was my grandfather, who voted for Jimmy Carter in 1976 because he was mad that the Republicans turned their backs on Nixon and allowed Stumbling Jerry, as he called him, to get into office. But I never really thought much about what it meant to be a Republican or a conservative. I didn't know a libertarian from a librarian. But then it was one day we were discussing farm subsidies, and I asked the professor a question about, I said, but don't we need farm subsidies? Because without government help, wouldn't there be a lot of bankrupt farmers? And my professor explained that, in fact, subsidies prop up large agribusiness that don't really need help, or marginal farmers who would be better off, and the economy and the country be better off if they put their time, talent, and resources to use in a better business. So subsidies actually hurt the economy. And somehow a little light went off in the back of my head that said, if government's lying to you about that, what else is the government lying to you about? And I should say I had kind of libertarianish instincts going back to high school, thinking about it. Reading in advanced English class, Thoreau had a huge impact on my thinking. It was kind of always out there, this idea that, government's bad. Why should I have to register with Selective Service when I turned 18? Why should I have to? Why are friends of mine being kicked out of school and going to jail for using plants for recreational purposes? Say no more about that. But that sort of put the piece in the puzzle. And so I began to read and talk to him more. And he was very involved with FEE. In fact, he was president of FEE for a time in the 90s. And he got me reading The Freeman. I also started reading National Review. And as an econ major, I had to read the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, which this was the Reagan years, and it was still when Robert Bartley was editorial page. So it wasn't totally pro-liberty. And I still had the blind spot at the time of foreign policy, like a lot of conservatives and even a lot of libertarians did, because communism. And but I did gain skepticism of the military-industrial complex, at least, and saw them as a necessary evil at best. After the Cold War fell, obviously that changed. And I also discovered Reason magazine and eventually Liberty magazine. the Libertarian Party, and this guy named Ron Paul. And I actually remember talking to people in the 80s about Ron Paul and saying, it's too bad he's not in Congress anymore, because he's someone I would love to work for. And I remember when I decided to be the second person in my family to not vote Republican, I was watching the GOP 1988 convention when George Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." I turned to my roommate and said, I think he's lying. I'm going to vote for Ron Paul.
Foreshadowing there.
Well, actually, he did keep his promise, because he didn't impose a lot of new taxes. He just raised all the old ones.
And the loophole is where the demon is in the loopholes right there. And how did you get involved? You attended some meetings with the John Randolph Society, right, as well?
I did. I through my reading, I became aware of, and I was a libertarian, but I also was still keeping a foot in conservative circles. I was a big fan of Pat Buchanan and Joe Sobran, and after the wall fell, I kind of followed them into, and also kind of went with my libertarian gut into a more rational and sane foreign policy. And actually, question that it was Nick Gillespie actually asked me once when I was telling him about my background. He said, if what you knew now and everything you've read since you were in college, if you had that background today, do you think you would still be a hawk even with the Cold War? And I said, that's a good question. I said, I have a feeling the answer would be no. But anyway, certainly after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, whatever justification there may have been for pretending that you could be pro-liberty and pro-militarism evaporated. And so I became a consistent libertarian. I also, at that time, because I went from reading Mises and Hayek, and even some of the Chicago school people like Milton Friedman and Richard Epstein, who I studied in law school, law and economics, to Rothbard. And I became a full-blown Rothbardian. And oddly enough, through reading one of his more academic papers, A Theory of Utility and Welfare Economics, I believe is the title of it. And what kind of got me into the full Rothbard program was just the argument that the realization that the subjective value and the cost calculation arguments apply to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even the things that we view as kind of off limits, that you're taught to view as kind of off limits, that, everyone, courts, police, fire protection, defense services, all of those things are completely off limits because only government can provide. Who will build the roads? Well, how do you decide what the adequate amount of resources to invest in a road is without a market test? And I think that argument, it's one that I don't think our side makes a whole lot, but I think if you think about that, then you realize that the consistent Misesian program was actually fulfilled by Rothbard, not abandoned by Rothbard, as some Austrians, Misesians, tried to convince me of when I was a young man, so still trying to figure this stuff out on my own.
Good old infighting within, always the purity test within the circles.
So I became involved in pro-liberty, anti-war activities in the early 90s. I was already involved with the Federalist Society. I did a DC internship my second year in law school at the National Taxpayers Union. Through that, I discovered the burgeoning Republican Liberty Caucus and the Libertarian Republican Organizing Committee. I became their Pennsylvania coordinator, and because of that, I became friends with Justin Raimondo, who got me involved with anti-Gulf War activities. There was a libertarian, conservative anti-war group called, I think, Conservatives Against the Mideast Holocaust or something like that. And it was basically the people who became known as the Paleo Alliance at the time. Murray, Lou, Joe Sobran was in it. I think maybe Paul Gottfried. John Utley was one of the leaders of it, the late John Basil Utley. And through that, I also started reading the Rothbard Rockwell Report. I discovered paleo-libertarianism And it kind of put a lot of things together for me in terms of answering some of the questions about, does the libertarian movement have a role for believers and for the middle class? And through my association and reading of that, I got the answer, which was not only does it, but it must and it should. And as much as Ayn Rand contributed to the popularization of a lot of our ideas, she was very wrong in giving the back of her hand to Christianity. Yes, there is a narrative that you can draw from history that the church has at times been an opponent of liberty, but there's a more compelling narrative that the church, by providing our counterbalance to state power and actually serving as a higher authority than government. One of the reasons Jesus was crucified and one of the reasons he was seen as a threat to the Roman and Israeli authorities at the time was because his teaching was that the state does not serve as God. It is accountable to God, as all other institutions and all other human beings are. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God. But if everything is God, then ultimately very little or nothing is left to Caesar. And, the fact that Murray Rothbard and his circle, who were very radical, actually radicalized the libertarian movement and libertarianism in many ways. The fact that they were all very pro-Christian in terms of their view of the place of the role of the church in promoting and safeguarding liberty throughout history was a big influence for me. And I would say that in terms of intellectual influences, obviously Murray would be number one. Second, in terms of influence and also just being one of the funniest and most fun people to spend an evening with was Ralph Raico, Murray's close friend and a top scholar of the Mises Institute. But I got to know Murray through going to the Randolph Club and the whole Paleo Alliance thing. And that kind of gets distorted and smeared a lot. But basically, it was just a very simple idea. As I said, it was just the idea that the libertarian movement has lost touch with the idea that it should represent and appeal to middle America. It got too influenced by kind of a left-wing cultural dynamic. And part of that might have been because it was founded at a time when if you were anti-war, anti-draft, even anti-corporatism, you were a person of the left. And if you were a person of the left, then your allies and friends would have been people of certain cultural values, which weren't those of middle America. But in the late 80s, early 90s, it was kind of time to move away from that. And also that the libertarian movement had moved away from what Rothbard always saw as the right strategy, which was populism. You need to base it on the idea that, as Murray very pithily put it, the masses might conduct a lynching once in a while, but they're pretty much just want to be left alone to live their lives. It's the elites who benefit from the growth of the state. And that's true, except I would say that if you look at history, I think you'll find that most lynching that the masses support, it's support because they've been lied to and whipped up into a frenzy by a demagogue who wants to use that anger for political power. And I would actually go further, I think, than a lot of us go in to say that libertarianism has to be populist, and populists must be libertarians, true populists, because our philosophy is you govern yourself. You make your own choices. You're responsible for yourself. You go out and you have the right to live as you choose. What could be more populist than that? As opposed to saying that populism is we're going to overthrow the elites to replace it with Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. Now, obviously, of those two, I have a strong preference to which one I would prefer to sit in the Oval Office. But even still, they're still exercising power. They're still exercising a bureaucracy, even if it's done in the name of the people. That doesn't necessarily reflect, my will. Everything Donald Trump didn't reflect what I think of as a populist agenda. Certainly everything that a left populist would do would not reflect a populist agenda. Whereas, say, a Ron Paul presidency, everything he would do would be aimed at empowering individuals, which is the ultimate in populism.
Well, I think you definitely see that play out right now. It's interesting within the way the intellectual battle is going on right now. Like you have on the right, so that the rise of, they want to claim themselves as being, common good conservatives. The problem is, though, is that if you don't have any sort of economic foundation, then you're not really, you're making claims in the name of the common good, but ultimately you're not focusing on the institutions that are preying upon the masses as a whole, right? And you see this play with the left. The left's embrace of ridiculous debt and monetary policy, things like that, has fueled the corporate consolidation that they claim to want to, the very Wall Street firms that they claim to want to occupy, things like that. If you don't have an economic foundation, all this sort of stuff, even if you are a good, well-intentioned left-wing populist, you're ultimately going to end up serving the enemy class.
Well, when you look at something like Dodd-Frank, for example, which was supposed to, were you there?
I came in afterwards, 2011. So I was not there for the battles.
That was an exciting time. And interestingly, the time after the crash, and this is something I think a lot of people don't really understand. I don't want to sound too elitist, especially after I just issued a 5-minute advertisement for libertarian populism. But if you're not there, I don't think you can understand it. But the time after the crash, it kind of resembled, was most to me like the time after 9/11, except that the fear was that businesses weren't going to be able to write checks the next week, and not that we're going to die of anthrax or by a bombing. And what was also kind of like running around thinking, like, what do we do? And somebody once said, and I think it was Joe Sobrand, but I've never been able to confirm this, even in the age of Google, that it's not a conspiracy, it's a consensus. And in DC, the consensus is not just never let a crisis go to waste, but one of the things that makes us different is when a crisis occurs, the first thing we think is, how did government cause this? Or what is government doing that can make it worse? And how can more liberty solve the crisis? But in DC, it's, oh my God, there's a crisis. We need to do something. And part of it is, I think there's a viewpoint in DC that nobody ever lost an election for letting the market work. Nobody's ever lost an election for during an economic downturn saying, look, it's the business cycle. It was caused by the Fed. If we let the Fed print a lot of money and let Congress spend a lot of money, the next crisis is just going to be worse. So we just need to ride it out. Nobody ever lost an election by doing the opposite. And, it was that kind of panicked atmosphere. And that's what led to the Patriot Act. And that's what led to Dodd-Frank, panic. That's also what led to Sarbanes-Oxley, the kind of like Dodd-Frank 1.0, the Clinton anti-terrorism bill that was passed after Oklahoma City was to the Patriot Act, which, by the way, just to repeat this, but I think it's always worth remembering that the Patriot Act, a lot of those provisions were taken off the shelf from stuff that Clinton wanted after Oklahoma City, but didn't get because the Republican Congress, which was a lot more skeptical of the police state and of foreign intervention, a lot of that because of the influence of the Buchananite paleo grassroots populist forces that he mobilized in 92 and 96, than they were obviously after September 11th. Was just taken off the shelf and shoved in there. I think a lot of what Dodd-Frank wanted was stuff that people like Elizabeth Warren and probably people like Barney Frank had been dreaming of putting in for years. And it shows something, I think, one of Milton Friedman's good observations, I believe it was Friedman, who said that politicians reach for whatever ideas are prominent on their shelf. So it's our job to make sure that our ideas are the ones within arm's reach on their shelves. And the way to do that is to change as Dr. Paul and Lou Rockwell and others have said, is you change the intellectual climate, you change the popular climate, you make our ideas predominant in the culture, among grassroots activists, among the people, and then instead of the Hayekian, it trickles down from the high intellectuals to the masses. I think we have a trickle-up theory where we educate the masses, and then the masses will trickle it up to the politicians, and then we'll get into another one of Friedman's good observations. And I apologize for continually quoting Milton Friedman on a Mises Institute podcast. The goal is not to make a Congress where it's a majority good guys, because that's just probably unlikely, but to make them operate in an intellectual and political climate where even the good guys are pressured to vote for our policies. I think the Mises Institute has been doing a great job by changing that climate by working to change that climate of opinion, and especially in the last what's it been now, 14 years or 15 years since the Ron Paul revolution, because as a friend of mine, Peter Klein's wife, Sandy put it once in 2007, 2008, and then in the years following that, all these young people got interested in these ideas by Ron Paul, and through Ron, they discovered Lou Rockwell's wonderful Mises Institute.
No longer it all starts with Ayn Rand. It all starts with Ron Paul, and it's definitely been true with most of the people. I mean, it's still interesting to see the impact it has on Mises U attendees, that were much younger back in the peak of the revolution, that they're still influenced by the energy and what Ron was able to bring to the table.
Someone who was working at IHS, at the Institute for Humane Studies at the time, told me that when you run their numbers of inquiries, you definitely can see an uptick starting in 2007 and going forward of interest in their programs. And he said the only explanation for that is Ron Paul.
And it's interesting how many organizations, libertarian organizations in particular, that benefited from then. A lot of them were perfectly okay with sort of the culturally left, like they were okay with the parts of the movement that the Paleo Project was intent on disassociating with, and yet many of these same organizations were able to benefit from the popularity of Ron's campaign in 2008 in particular, and 2012, that era. But speaking of the broader issue of changing the intellectual environment, I think the intellectual environment of one group in particular is that political staff or class, which often can have so much influence behind the scenes in terms of how policy goes. I know when I was there, again, 2011 till 2013 or so, like I was just shocked by just the lack of intellectual curiosity amongst financial services staffers, right? Like they're what was your experience dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley and everything going on there? Obviously during the peak of the Dodd-Frank days, and I know that there was opportunities there for some interesting bipartisan cooperation there, right? There was people I think often forget the Federal Reserve audit that was put in place. It was a short-term thing, but I believe good old who's the Florida Democrat, Alan Grayson. There really was some bipartisan populist push there. What was it like just hearing, listening to staffers talk about economics at a time during a financial crisis? Because again, I'm guessing a lot of the conversations being had there were not very Rothbardian, but just very lashy. Be curious to know how bad it was.
People forget this. The Tea Party actually began with the bailouts. It didn't begin with Obama. It was an anti-Bush movement at first, because Bush was the president who was pushing bailouts, because people had this sense that, my neighbor's losing his house. I'm losing my retirement savings, and they're worried about the big banks and Wall Street. And what is this Federal Reserve? That guy from Texas who I think made a lot of sense during the primaries, but everyone on the news told me not to listen to him. Well, maybe if we'd listened to him, we wouldn't be in this problem. And that's what gave rise to the Tea Party. And so you kind of had that split in the Republican Party between the grassroots populists who were going to go with the new Tea Party and the Liberty Movement, and then the establishment Republicans who were going to do what Hank Paulson and John Boehner and George Bush told them. Then during Dodd-Frank, because it was Obama's bill and we were opposed to everything Obama did, you had a lot more Republicans going against it. And some of them were thoughtful people. Some of them were people who supported the bailouts, but thought this was just going too far and even understood it was setting up the next bailout. And then some of them were just, this is Obama's bill, so it's bad. You say, okay, well, what if it was George Bush's bill? Well, George Bush wouldn't do something like this. Well, he did do stuff like this and your boss voted for it. Well, if George Bush did it, then I'm sure it was different and I'm sure it was okay. But you're right, there's not often a lot of intellectual curiosity among staffers. Occasionally, before the revolution, I would get kind of perplexed questions from staffers asking me things like, why doesn't your boss like Alan Greenspan? And a lot of this was during the 90s and even during the early aughts when Greenspan still had that reputation as the maestro. I think even Jennifer Flowers, who some of your older listeners might remember as being the first Clinton scandal during the late 90s. Clinton gets credit for the booming economy, but that's probably just Alan Greenspan's doing. Et tu, Jennifer? And I think Ron actually told me once that he was approached by Republicans saying, like, Ron, you've got to join us for our floor speech tonight because you're going to really like it. 'Cause we're going to talk about the Fed because Clinton's out there taking credit for the economy, and we all know it's because of Alan Greenspan. And Ron came back and was just like amazed at this. And you see that now, right? It kind of in the opposite way, in that the Republicans' big new catchphrase is Bidenflation. Yes, Joe Biden is doing a horrible job as president. I think we all knew he'd do a horrible job. Even a lot of people who voted for him thought he wouldn't do a good job. I don't think they expected the complete collapse that we're seeing now. I think those of us who understand the business cycle understand that no matter who sits in the Oval Office, we were likely to have economic problems this year because you shut down the economy, you let the Fed go wild with money printing, and now you're saying the Fed's going to keep pumping money into the economy. We're going to let consumers loose, and you're sitting there saying, like, well, why are prices rising and why are there supply problems? Gee, I don't know. What exactly did you expect to happen when you shut down the economy for the better part of a year because of a virus with a 99% survival rate for most people?
I can't wait to see how many of these Republicans that are campaigning against Bidenflation, particularly the Senate, will end up voting for Jay Powell because, golly gosh darn, at least he's a Republican, right? They're going to explicitly endorse the man that has pumped in all the money the last couple of years.
Well, oddly enough, as Dr. Paul pointed out in his column this week, the best comment about Powell came from Elizabeth Warren, of all people. She said he was dangerous. The problem is she doesn't understand what makes him dangerous because she thinks he's not doing enough to implement all the policies that she championed that became part of Dodd-Frank. And she's concerned with the Fed's insider trading. And I understand the Stock Act and the outrage over Pelosi trades and but I do think it's kind of a distraction from the real issue, which is, why do members of Congress get all this inside information? I think the founders would be horrified, not just at the blatant corruption, for lack of a better word, of members profiting from information they gain on their job, but from the fact that, why would a private business provide information to Congress about this, or how would Congress get this information? And also, of course, a lot of it, I wonder if there's been any studies breaking down just how many of these trades of Congress are related to the military-industrial complex. What members of Congress are going to make stock trades in military companies that will coincide with the arming of Ukraine, which sending arms to a country to fight invasion, when that country's foreign minister laughed at the possibility that they would be invaded by their neighbor? Who's going to profit from that? And is Nancy Pelosi or Dianne Feinstein or any member of Congress going to profit? And what does that say about our foreign policy? What about the trades that might be in pharmaceuticals related to the COVID hysteria? I'm not suggesting that the policies are based on profit. I'm suggesting that the policies that members of Congress open up profit opportunities for them, which they take advantage of.
I remember back in the day. I mean, it was right before I came on board, but the way that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were using their bias towards certain lobbying strategies and things like that. I mean, like the whole countrywide scandal on offering great mortgage deals to staffers, directly playing a role in the industry. That's why I kind of push back against like some calls about term limits and things like that, is that the members are often kind of secondary to the professional political staffing class that survives lost elections. I remember the amount of power congressional committee policy staff has. Like a committee policy staff has far more influence over legislation than members of Congress. And then the relationship that staffers will have with lobbyists, with different industries, with all this sort of stuff. I mean, that itself is a whole nother level that we don't even see because it doesn't have the optics of elected positions.
And staffers in personal offices are run by committee staff.
Yeah, the amount of influence that they have on writing legislation, things like that. And then those staffers don't have any sort of interest in diving into the actual policy matters. You mentioned the pushback that you'd get, that Dr. Paul would get from Republicans. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between, like, since the one consistent during this time was, your office is in opposition, right? Dr. Paul is going to be Dr. No. What was the difference in dealing with, say, like a Newt Gingrich versus the Bush years versus, Boehner? How was the difference in the way that Republican leadership would deal with Dr. Paul and you guys, you troublemakers?
Gingrich kind of left Ron alone in a lot of ways. He got occasionally some pushback on a few things, but there was one time, one of Gingrich's bad deals with Clinton, one bad spending deal, and he had a conference meeting, and he got up and he said, I know nobody likes this deal, but I've got something in here that almost every member wants, either an earmark or some policy change or something. So I expect every Republican to vote for it. And then he paused and he goes, the only Republican that I'm going to give a pass to is Ron Paul. And that's because I don't want it to get out that I'm pressuring Ron Paul to vote for this bill, because I don't want to hear from every libertarian in the country being mad at me again. Hastert was probably the worst speaker that I saw in a variety of ways, yes. But one of the things that made him the worst, and this was actually pointed out to me by an observation of one of my colleagues, is after Bush came in, he had no respect for the idea that he was a constitutional officer of a branch of government that was co-equal and in many ways superior to the executive branch. Instead, he treated his office as being subservient to the president because the president was of his own party. And he expected all Republicans to act the same way. This was a guy who, when asked what his two proudest things accomplished during his tenure as Speaker, he said the prescription drug bill and an earmark for the Chicago airport. Now, I've been to the Chicago airport. It's very nice. But when you're the longest serving Republican Speaker of the House in modern history, and your two greatest accomplishments are the biggest expansion of the welfare state since the Great Society and an earmark, there's something wrong there. And Hastert was very unfriendly to Ron. And during the Bush years, there were a lot of times, like, just very petty things done, like money that should have automatically gone to our district was being withheld. And a lot of times it was because Republican appropriations chairman decided that rather than support a Republican member of Congress, even though they did, which is supposed to be what they're supposed to do, they decided to stick it to Ron and be friendly to the Democrats on their committee. We had stories of Karl Rove flying into the district to try to recruit Democratic local office holders to switch to Republicans with promise that Rove could raise them millions of dollars. And they were laughed at and said, you're not going to defeat Ron Paul in a Republican primary in this district. Sorry. After the 2006 election, even before the revolution, in the months between Pelosi taking power and Ron becoming a national figure with a national following, Ron was treated much better. One of the changes was that the chairmanship of the financial committee went from someone who was very much more of a centrist corporatist Republican, Mike Oxley, to Spencer Baucus, who was by no means a libertarian, but was at least a believer in fair play and also was more of a conventional conservative. So Ron got what he deserved, which was his ranking membership and then chairmanship of the Monetary Committee, even from Spencer, even before Ron became a national figure. And there was also, as we used to comment on at the time, like, wow, look at all these new converts to Ron's position we've made. Because now look at how many votes we're getting against these big spending bills from Republican side. Whereas just last year, Ron would have been the only Republican to vote against it, or the only member of Congress, period, to vote against this bill.
And obviously, the government's bigger than it's ever been before. I mean, there's not a lot of positive things that have ever come out from the federal government at all, but particularly the last few decades. But the degree to which it is the expected sort of position on the right, even if it's often hypocritical in terms of party identification, it does seem that there's a bit more of an ideological push if we're trying to find little reasons for optimism, right? And it doesn't come from some sort of broad. We're not living in a Rothbardian Republican Party by any means. And again, as soon as you have a Republican president or Republican controlled House, I mean, again, Trump years for spending was absolutely crazy. At least, I mean, I think you can see it particularly now. The drumbeats for audit the Fed, which is something that went from something that completely off the radar to it feels like every congressional session, it gets a vote. It gets the majority of Republicans. It gets through the House and it doesn't get through the Senate. Some of this is theater, right? Some of them, perhaps no one really expects anything big to go, and it's just kind of an easy press release. But still, though, just the fact that these sort of issues are, someone is still filing this bill, now going on, about 10 years since Dr. Paul's been in the House. I think that's little reasons for optimism in terms of a little bit of the intellectual environment.
Yes, getting Audit the Fed through was a tremendous victory, and that was because of Campaign for Liberty's mobilization of grassroots activists. The fact that even established Republicans felt that they had to give Ron and his followers something in 2012, and the chairmanship of the Monetary Policy Subcommittee. Even if Ron hadn't run in 2008, and still Republicans took control of the House, I think Spencer still would have supported Ron getting the chairmanship because he was a straight shooter and a fair player, as having worked for him.
Well, it was interesting too is that he had some sympathy because Boehner tried to nix his becoming chairman of the committee. So he not for the same reasons as Dr. Paul, but very mindful of making sure the members got their just positions.
I didn't know that, but that's interesting. But I think that the reason that Boehner basically didn't fight Dr. Paul getting the position was that, and as you know, even still, a lot of the things that Ron wanted to do, he was, staff was not always sympathetic to Ron and Ron's people. I know Paul Martin and Lydia used to complain to me about kind of some staffers trying to stymie what they wanted to do. But it was because you had the Liberty Movement, you had the Tea Party, and I think Boehner was smart enough to realize that the last thing he wanted to do, because if you recall, even the night of the election in 2010, that was a wonderful night for me, by the way, because I got home and I was going to a party at Morton Blackwell's Leadership Institute. And as I was getting ready, I put on the news. And the first thing I heard was Rachel Maddow and Chris Matthews having to announce that Rand Paul has been declared the winner of the Kentucky Senate race. But they were passing out buttons that said GOP gone on probation, which meant that, we're supporting you because we don't like what Obama and Pelosi and Harry Reid are doing to the country. We don't like this Obamacare stuff. We're scared of what they'll do if they have another at least 2 years of complete control of the government. But we're still mad about the spending and the bailouts. And even a lot of us are starting to come around to a more, if not a complete Ron Paul view, at least a more nuanced view of your wars. So don't think that we're completely team Republican now. So Boehner knew, given all that the last thing he wanted to do was pick a fight with the grassroots by denying the person who is widely acknowledged as the intellectual leader of the Tea Party on a lot of issues, particularly on the new Fed's skepticism, if not outright opposition to the Federal Reserve, denying him the chairmanship of the Monetary Policy Subcommittee.
I'm interested to get your perspective as someone who was in the office prior to the '08 elections. But like, you would see members of Congress go up to Dr. Paul and ask him to sign a copy of The Revolution because his grandson was a big fan. And I mean, I think one of the things that I know that Lydia Mashburn and Paul Martin Foss and others took a great pride in when he took that chairmanship was the educational aspect that the office did, and bringing in people like Joe Salerno and Jim Grant doing congressional staffer trainings. And you would have a lot of staffers from a variety of different offices. And I think that was also kind of one of the neat things. Obviously, I was a benefit of it, but you had a variety of staffers from non-libertarian offices, that would seek out you guys because you were the shining beacon of what could be done. How is that like in seeing just that impact of Ron Paul's broader popularity, the dynamics within the Capitol itself? Did staffers start treating you differently? Did offices start coming out to you more because of the national campaigns, or was that perhaps or perhaps am I overselling it at all?
Oh, there definitely was a huge difference. I remember it started for me about April or May. Staffer from a Republican office who was always very friendly, but never really expressed any interest in Ron or what we were doing or what we were all about, came up to me in the cafeteria and said, when I flew into my boss's district and as the plane was landing, I saw this huge banner that said Ron Paul for president. And she said, your boss has a lot of support in our district. And I'm thinking well, good. I didn't say this, but thinking good, maybe your boss can start voting more with Ron then. And I know Ron would tell stories about how people would come up to him asking, how are you getting all this support? What really increased the interest, which won't surprise anyone who understands modern politics, was the money bomb. How is Ron Paul outraising John McCain and Rudy Giuliani with all these small donors? He literally had people coming up pestering him on the floor of the House to ask what his secret was, because I think part of them just because they were so tied into the idea that the way you raise money is to listen to your consultants, go out and please the big donors, and have a fundraising plan in place that will have messages for certain groups, and then you'll make these appeals and you'll run ads and you'll have these fundraisers. And the idea that a guy would just stand up on a debate stage and talk from his brain and from his heart about what he really believes, and that would appeal to people so much that the grassroots would go out and use the internet to organize on their own and raise, $5 million in one day, was just foreign to them. And keep in mind, too, it was a very different world still in '07. The idea of online internet fundraising was still something that was foreign to a lot of political types. It wasn't like today where, of course, that's how you're going to raise money. The idea of, the money bomb is somewhat common today. These one-day special event things. Back then, the money bomb was something that was originated by the Ron Paul grassroots. But I think it's kind of caught on, not just for candidates, but for liberty organizations in general. Blimps, not so much. Blimps don't seem to have caught on. You don't see a lot of blimps.
It's a shame.
There's no Mises Institute blimp. Is there floating around Auburn?
I got to check with Jeff to see where we are on that one. When you are a figure like Ron Paul, you really represent your nation is the entire country. Like you are an ideological figure. The most influential members of Congress today are within that Ron Paul mold, right? They don't, unfortunately, none of them have Ron Paul values. Some might be closer than others, but they really have that role where they are representing ideologically driven, a passionate group, and from that are able to take advantage of a nationwide fundraising base with small donors that are constantly contributing, and it gives them power to really buck the system. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, she's one of the biggest fundraisers in the Republican Party right now, in spite of all of the drama that she attracts from her fellow colleagues, precisely because she has this sort of moment. And that does make a change within some of the power structures, because I know that that's the way the RNC is able to pull a lot of strings based off of controlling campaign contributions.
And also Thomas Massie, I know it wasn't to raise money that he famously held up the vote on the first stimulus package for the COVID, to deal with COVID, saying basically, Congress needs to come back and do their jobs, which to me was only fair because literally the day before Massie did that, I read a story about Pence addressed a group of meat packers, thanking them for going to do their work during the middle of a pandemic and saying that it's tough, but it's necessary because you guys are essential. And I was thinking, so people in DC are basically admitting is that meat packers are more essential to the American economy than members of Congress. Or Massie is right. You can't agree with both statements. But anyway, Massie had a tremendous fundraising day for that, for doing the right thing. And it's because of that grassroots online network that started with the 2007 money bond. Another example is, Paul Teller, right?
Yeah.
Paul Teller is a great guy. He ran the Republican Study Committee for several years, which is the organization of conservative members on the Hill that is kind of the loyal, sometimes disloyal opposition to the Republican leadership. He got canned from the RSC under pressure from Boehner because he was doing what he's supposed to do, which is working with outside organizations to try and pressure the Republican conference to uphold their principles. And he immediately was hired by Ted Cruz. And Tim Carney from the Washington Examiner wrote a column saying that this shows the power of, at that time, it was still the Tea Party movement and members, in that several years ago, Teller wouldn't have been able to land a job because he would have been blackballed by the establishment, and he might not have felt as comfortable acting on principle or supporting the Tea Party or the Liberty Movement against the establishment as he did. But because this kind of outside force has arisen now, there's more challenges of that, and that still exists. It might be more Trumpy than pure liberty than it was 10 years ago, and there might be some explanations for that, but it still does exist. And the establishment is not nearly as powerful as it once was.
The number of congressional staffers that I've had reach out to me because they're interested in Mises Institute ideas over the last few years has been, it's one of those little things that, again, we're not trying to oversell, what's going on here. Again, the Tea Party didn't get much done in the long run, but I think, again, people in the seats matter in these sort of things. Like, people in the positions matter, and you need people that can fill these offices, kind of push things in the right direction. And we've created a much easier environment for Rothbardians and people simply sympathetic to have some of these positions. And that's one of the things that gives me optimism going forward.
It does. And there's a little bit of a danger right now. Parts of the populist right and some of their leaders, both in Congress and out, they're allowing their justifiable disdain for the actions of some of the big tech companies to lead them into embracing dangerous things like increased antitrust regulation, and not just increased use of antitrust, but even going back to the intellectual foundations of kind of like old school progressive antitrust that says bigness in and of itself is bad, as opposed to questioning whether, what is a monopoly? What are the real sources of monopolies? And turning their backs on what was the consensus opinion of libertarian and conservative intellectuals, which is that either, I think there were three camps, either one, the hardcore Austrian, that there's no need for antitrust laws, B, monopolies exist, but if you look at most monopolies, you'll find that there's some kind of government privilege, subsidy, or government blockage of entry into the industry that makes these monopolies possible. And then the third position is more the Chicago school position, the Robert Bork position, that antitrust laws are necessary, monopolies are evil, but bigness is not bad in and of itself. Bigness is only bad if it hurts the consumer. And whether or not it hurts other competitors, this should not really be the function of government regulators, to a position that says that bigness is bad in and of itself because, look, Facebook is big and look at what it's doing to us. And not asking themselves, what barriers are there entry that are caused by government? What is Facebook and Google's relationship with government? Are Facebook and Google censoring conservatives and various other dissident points of view on both the right and the left on things like vaccines because they want to stay in good graces with government? Joe Biden calls on social media platforms to stop allowing the spread of what he calls anti-vaccine misinformation. And then immediately, some prominent vaccine critics find their YouTube accounts suspended and their Facebook pages shut down.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like the same way, like the fairness doctrine was not intended to actually promote fairness within radio talk shows. It was meant to censor the successful brand of conservative talk radio out there. I think any attempts to try to deal with issues like this from a federal level, I mean, you're playing in a court that's not going to end in your favor. I mean, it's going to strengthen the regime, and the regime will enforce the narrative of the regime. I think it's a little bit different on some of these state level stuff on trying to deal with some consumer protections and things like that. That's I think it's a different issue. But that is one of the things that does scare me, though, about the current environment. It extends from a much larger poor quality of economic education out there generally, but there is something of a know-nothing sort of style when it comes to economic issues on parts of the populist right. But there is, a bit of that know-nothing sort of tendency where, I saw someone, for example, they were defending the ideas of price controls as a way of dealing with inflation and saying, oh, we need to do this because this is obviously good. And, oh, well, Milton Friedman's going to be rolling in his grave, but who cares? And it's like, no, I think the issue isn't that you're owning Milton Friedman. I mean, the issue is that this sort of stuff is going to, it is going to diminish community. It's going to diminish, it's going to hurt families. It's going to, go against everything that you claim, the moral arguments that you're trying to, claim to, to have some sort of hold on. Saying, no, this isn't about, the financial sector getting owned. I mean, this has real ramifications here. What other things is the Market Institute working on right now in terms of this current political environment and trying to navigate it?
That's our big priority right now. Some of the other stuff we might look at is this whole healthcare issue, which is not going away. And in fact, we probably need to develop more focus on that because we see the left is continuing to focus. And after the Republicans made a disaster of repealing and replacing Obamacare, which that sounds good in theory if you're going to replace it with a market, and if you're going to start by acknowledging that Obamacare was designed to address legitimate problems, but it addressed legitimate problems by giving us more of what caused the problems in the first place, which is government meddling, as opposed to Obamacare light. But the left is not going to stop pushing for more government intervention. In fact, in the last two presidential elections, the candidate who really forcefully ran on a program of repealing and replacing Obamacare was Bernie Sanders, because that's what really Medicare for all is. By definition, it's repeal and replace Obamacare. Repeal and replace it with something worse. Also, I just want to say, you brought up this new thing of common good conservatism, which is a new euphemism for big government conservatism. It reminded me of during the primaries of the 99 and 2000 run up to the Republican primaries, when W first started talking about how he was a compassionate conservative, there was some pushback among conservative intellectuals and grassroots conservatives who said, so is he saying that the rest of us aren't compassionate? And I think you could say that about common good conservative. Like, are you saying that conservatives and libertarians who don't share all your policy prescriptions, that we don't care about the common good?
I think their argument would be that too much focus on the individual can end up defending things that are bad for the community as a whole. I think the old-fashioned, bad neighbor problem. For example, if you want to reject, say Rothbardian individual rights, whatever, from in terms of kind of trying to build a better, more cohesive society. Okay, if that's your objection, okay. But I think the mimesis is like utilitarianism, stuff like that. What they're doing is they're debating a straw man when they focus on that. And perhaps, there are parts of the libertarian movement and culture that will defend this sort of stuff to these grand extents. And maybe there are caricatures within libertarianism and libertarian circles that might feed the sort of boogeyman they're going up against. But ultimately, I think that's the beauty of sort of Misesian focus on civilization and community, is that this isn't simply a defense of the individual for the sake of defending the individual, without any sort of thought on larger communities, stuff. But again, ultimately, everything that they're calling for is against the common good. Like they're interfering with the the order the natural order that arises from a free market. And that's that's the true grounding of this stuff, rather than, stock number go up, or kind of, the more like purely sort of materialistic sort of defenses out there. And so again, hopefully that's an area where, again, going back full circle to kind of where we began, if there's any opportunities for, our ideas to reach out to this new conservatism that's populist in nature and claims to care about the middle class, I think our arguments within kind of the Misesian Rothbardian tradition are unique here, and hopefully that is where we will have victory going forward.
Contrary to what even one of the leading paleoconservative thinkers used to talk about, libertarians believing in economic man, and it was kind of interesting because he was someone who was part of the Paleo Alliance and associated with Murray Lou and Hans Hoppe and the rest of the Mises circle, but never really understood what we were all about, though. No, we're not economic man. We're human beings. We're pro-human beings, and we see people as full people, each one with their own hopes, dreams, and aspirations, and we see freedom as the best way to pursue that. And we don't just reduce everything to a market transaction. I saw a quote recently from Ralph Raico: "The market may treat people like commodities, but the state treats people like garbage."
I think that is a good way to end this episode. Norman, it's been so much fun catching up with you. Ladies and gentlemen, until next time, this has been Radio Rothbard. For Norm Singleton, this is Tho Bishop.